Story 1. I remember that night like it just happened. It was my second month as a junior doctor, still trying to find my footing, still getting used to the relentless night shifts on the wards. You'd think after a few weeks the exhaustion would settle into something manageable, but it never did. It was sometime past 3 a.m. I was trying to catch a few minutes of rest in the on-call room when my pager went off. It was one of the nurses. The message was simple: Bay 4, patient passed. Please verify. I sighed, pushed myself up from the chair and rubbed my face. Night deaths weren't uncommon. The elderly, the terminally ill, they slipped away quietly, often with no family around. This was just another formality, one of many I'd done. The ward was dimly lit, eerily quiet. At this hour, everything felt muted, distant. I made my way to Bay 4, the private room at the end of the corridor. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The room was grim. Not outright creepy, but there was something about it. The overhead lights were low, casting long, still shadows against the walls. The air had zero plus that stale, closed-off smell, a mixture of disinfectant and something else, something I couldn't quite place. The patient lay there on the bed, an old man, thin and frail, his skin pale and waxy under the fluorescent glow. The nurse had pulled the sheet up to his chest, his arms resting by his sides. He looked peaceful, as they often did after passing, eyes closed, mouth slightly open. It was routine. I took a deep breath and began the process. Stethoscope out, I placed it against his chest. No sounds, no respiration, no heartbeat. My breath fogged slightly in the cold air. I pressed a knuckle hard against his sternum, rubbing in a firm circular motion. No response. Nothing. He was gone. I leaned in closer to check the pupils. My fingers lifted one eyelid, and I reached for my pen torch, balancing forward over the bed. That's when it happened. The old man lurched forward, not a twitch, not a reflex. He moved, his face suddenly inches from mine. I screamed, loud, instinctive. The kind of scream you don't even realize you're making until you hear it bouncing off the walls. His mouth had snapped open wider than I thought possible. His lips were dry and cracked, teeth yellowed. But what hit me the most was his eyes. Those milky, glazed-over eyes staring straight into mine, pupils dilated and empty. My back hit the wall before I even realized I'd stumbled away. The crash echoed through the room, but I didn't care. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I was going to pass out. I could still see his face, his skin sagging unnaturally, his breath. No, there was no breath. He was dead. I knew he was dead, but he had moved. I don't know how long I stood there, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The room felt impossibly small, the shadows stretching toward me. He hadn't moved again. He still lay there, exactly as before, mouth slightly open, eyes closed. Had I imagined it? The exhaustion, the dim lighting. Was my mind playing tricks on me? I didn't check. I didn't stay to find out. I turned and bolted out of the room, my breath still shaky. I nearly collided with one of the nurses outside. She grabbed my arm. "Doctor, are you okay? What happened?" I looked back at the door, my mind racing. The rational part of me wanted to say it was a muscle spasm, some post-mortem reflex, but I knew what I saw. I swallowed. My throat was dry. Nothing. He's gone. He's gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of that shift. I avoided Bay 4 for the rest of the night. The next morning, they took the body to the morgue. I never went back to that room alone again. Story 2. I've been a firefighter for 15 years. Seen a lot of things I wish I hadn't. Burns, bodies, things you don't talk about over dinner. But there's one call that still keeps me up at night. One thing that I can't quite shake, no matter how many times I tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. We got called to a commercial fire, an old warehouse just outside town. The thing was already half gone by the time we arrived. Flames rolling out of the windows, black smoke pouring up into the sky. We fought it for hours, hammering the fire down section by section until it was finally under control. Then came the mop-up. That's always the worst part. The adrenaline's gone, the fire's mostly out, and all that's left is the ugly aftermath. Smoldering debris, collapsed beams, The smell of burned chemicals, burned wood, burned flesh. That's when we start finding them. If anyone was inside when the fire started, that's when we start seeing the bodies. Sometimes they're obvious, lying there like charred statues. Other times they're buried under rubble, twisted up in impossible ways. And sometimes you find them by stepping on them. That's exactly what happened to Rick. Rick was one of the newer guys, but solid, no-nonsense type. He was about 10 feet ahead of me, moving carefully through the wreckage, smoke still drifting in thick tendrils through the air. He stepped over a half-collapsed doorway, boots crunching over glass, and then crunch. I knew that sound. Not wood, not metal, something softer, wetter. Rick let out a choked sound and stumbled back, but his foot didn't come free. It was stuck. For a split second, everything went still. Then the thing on the floor moved. At first, I thought it was just shifting because Rick had disturbed it. But then I saw the arms. Thin, burned, blackened arms clawing at the air, twisting and reaching as the thing rose. Rick screamed. A real, full-throated, panicked scream. He tried to pull his foot free, but the thing came with him. It was stuck to his boot, its ribs locked around him like some kind of grotesque bear trap. Its head lolled forward, half a skull left, one eye socket just a black pit. The other side was melted flesh, the jaw gone, tongue fused to the remains of its throat, and it was moving. Its arms flailed, one hand grabbing at Rick's pant leg, the other twitching, clawing at the air. I didn't even think. I just reacted. I stepped forward, grabbed Rick under the arms, and yanked him backward with everything I had. We went down hard, slamming onto the wet, ashy ground, but it worked. His foot came free, leaving behind a torn, blackened chunk of something that had once been a rib cage. The thing collapsed onto its back, arms still twitching, and then it made a sound. Not a human sound. Not a moan, not a scream. Something dry, crackling, like wind through dead leaves, like embers popping in a dying fire. It wasn't alive, it couldn't be, but it was moving. It was making noise. Rick scrambled backward, kicking at the ground, gasping like he couldn't get enough air. I grabbed him, hauling him to his feet, shoving him toward the exit. Go! I don't know why, but I stayed, just for a second, just long enough to see it move again, arms flopping up weakly, ribs still flexing like it was trying to breathe. And then, as I turned to run, I swear to God, I swear on everything, I heard my name. A whisper, crackling like burning paper. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, coughing up smoke, my head spinning. Rick was already there, bent over, dry heaving into the dirt. One of the other guys was shouting, asking what happened, but I couldn't answer. I just looked back at the entrance, waiting, half expecting to see that thing crawl out after us. But nothing came. They found the body later. Well, what was left of it. They wrote it up as just another victim, one of the many who had been inside when the fire started. No one believed us when we tried to explain what happened. Bodies move sometimes, they said. Muscle contractions, reflexes. Yeah, maybe, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard, and so does Rick. He quit a week later. Me? I stayed, but I never went back to that building. Story 3. I used to work night shifts doing transport. Nothing fancy, mostly moving bodies from nursing homes, hospitals, and the occasional private residence. Sometimes they were heading to funeral homes. Other times, like this one, they were donations for science. You don't really think about it after a while. It's just a job. That night I had a drop-off at a medical research facility. I'd been there before, clinical, cold, with the kind of silence that sinks into your bones. The processing area was shaped like an L. The long part had the freezer, and around the corner were desks and filing cabinets. I wheeled the gurney inside, did the sign-in, and got the key to the freezer. The freezer was about the size of a 2-car garage, lined with metal shelves. Most of the remains, once processed, were wrapped in this thick blue tape. You could still tell what was inside: arms, legs, torsos. That always struck me as odd, but I never let myself think about it too much. Just another stop on the route. I unlocked the freezer, wheeled in the body, and got to work. Placed the deceased on the board, used the lift, and slid him onto a shelf. Routine. I locked the freezer back up and turned to wheel the gurney out when I heard it. A knock. Software quick. Coming from inside the freezer? I froze. It was probably nothing. I'd worked in morgues and medical facilities long enough to know about post-mortem movement. Muscles contracting, the odd sound escaping from a body. But this wasn't that. This was deliberate. A knock. Like someone tapping to get my attention. I turned back to the freezer. Just my nerves, I told myself. It's just the metal contracting from the cold. I put my hand on the gurney to steady myself and took a deep breath. The room was silent. But then, knock, knock. Louder this time. I didn't move. My mouth was dry and my hands felt too light, like my body wasn't fully mine. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the back of the freezer, behind the shelves, where I'd just placed the body. I took a step forward. Every logical part of me was screaming to just leave, but my feet kept moving. I reached the freezer door and rested my ear against the cold metal. My breath fogged up in front of me. Silence. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was just tired. I turned away. The knocking exploded against the metal. This time, it wasn't soft. It wasn't polite. It was urgent. Desperate. Bang, bang, bang. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the gurney. And then, a voice. Low, muffled, but unmistakable. Let me out. I don't know if I screamed or if the sound just died in my throat. My whole body went cold. That wasn't possible. The man I'd just brought in, he'd been dead for hours. There was paperwork, a death certificate. He wasn't alive. He couldn't be. But the knocking didn't stop. Neither did the voice. Let me out. I turned, fumbling for the keys, barely able to hold them. The freezer door was still locked. I had locked it. But that knocking, Jesus Christ, that knocking, I didn't want to open it. Every part of me was screaming not to. But what if they'd made a mistake? What if I had just locked a living person in a freezer? The knocking turned into pounding. The voice got louder. Let me out. I shoved the key into the lock. It jammed. My hands were shaking too much. I forced myself to breathe, to slow down. I tried again. The lock clicked. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The cold air rushed out in a thick fog. I stepped forward, half expecting to see the man sitting up on the shelf, confused, alive. But he wasn't. Nothing had moved. The body was still there, wrapped in the sheet, lifeless. Except a single strip of blue tape had been pulled loose, hanging from the shelf like someone had tried to claw their way out. I backed away. My vision blurred and my stomach twisted into knots. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and left the gurney where it was. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. I rushed down the L-shaped hallway, past the desks and filing cabinets, my footsteps too loud, too fast. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering. I reached the garage door, shoved it open, and stumbled outside into the night air. I stood there, hands on my knees, gasping. The cold from the freezer still clung to my skin. My heart felt like it was trying to break free from my chest. I didn't go back in, didn't finish the paperwork, didn't retrieve the gurney. I got in my van and drove, hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles went white. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it had to be. But to this day, I still remember the way the voice sounded. Muffled, distant, but so goddamn clear. And the worst part? I checked the obituaries the next morning. The man I dropped off had been declared dead. No mistakes, no errors. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had knocked, and that it had been real. I never took another job at that facility again. Story 4. I used to work in a morgue. It wasn't as bad as people think. Mostly quiet, mostly routine. I was a night shift attendant, responsible for logging in bodies, making sure everything was in order before the morning shift came in. The building itself was old. The city had expanded around it, but the morgue remained, tucked between newer structures like a forgotten relic. The walls were thick concrete, the hallways narrow and cold, and once you stepped inside, the smell of antiseptic, and something else, something deeper, harder to define, clung to the air. It was the kind of place that made silence feel heavier. There weren't many of us working nights, usually just me and a security guard named Tom. Tom was older, had been there for years, but he wasn't one for conversation. He liked to stay in his little office near the entrance, watching whatever late-night show was on. Then there was Mark. Mark had been with us for about 5 years before he killed himself. I wasn't working that night, but I heard about it the next day. He had used one of the empty drawers, climbed in, shut it, and swallowed a handful of pills. By the time they found him, he was ice cold. I didn't know him well, but the idea of choosing this place to die among the dead stuck with me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. They cleaned out his locker, his desk. Didn't take long before it was like he had never been there. Except for that one night. It was about 2 months after Mark died. Another slow shift. It was just me and Tom, same as always. We had brought in a fresh body earlier, some poor guy who had been hit by a car. But other than that, it was quiet. I was in the prep room doing paperwork. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly. The clock on the wall read 2:37 a.m. Then I heard it, a sound from the cold storage room. Not loud, just the faintest metallic creak, like something shifting inside. I looked up, listening. The cold storage was right through the double doors to my left. It wasn't unusual for the metal racks to settle, or for the air pressure to make a door groan. But this was different. It had weight to it. Then, another sound, a click. The sound of one of the drawer latches being undone. I stood up, heart pounding. The room was quiet again, but my skin had gone ice cold. I told myself it was nothing, but I had to check. I grabbed my clipboard, like that would do anything, and pushed through the doors into cold storage. The air hit me first, that deep, sterile chill that burned your lungs if you breathed too fast. The rows of steel drawers lined the walls, each one labeled. The room was dim, the overhead lights humming. Everything looked normal, but I knew I had heard something. I walked slowly, scanning the drawers. Then I saw it. One of the drawers was open. Not much, maybe an inch or two, but enough that I could see the darkness inside. The tag on the front read, Holloway Mark. I froze. We had cleared Mark out. I knew that. His body had been taken, cremated. There was no reason for his drawer to even be in use anymore. I swallowed hard. Maybe Tom had left it open. Maybe maintenance had been in here. Maybe the drawer slid out further, on its own. I swear to God I didn't move. I didn't touch it, but it rolled out, smooth and steady, stopping halfway. My breath caught in my throat. The slab inside was empty. No body, just an open space where Mark had died. And then, the lights flickered. Not a full outage, just a quick shudder, a blink. But in that half second of darkness, I saw something. A shape, a shadow curled inside the drawer. When the lights came back, it was gone. I stumbled back, knocking into a metal tray. It clattered to the floor, the sound deafening in the cold silence. My hands were shaking. My skin was burning with ice. I needed to get out. I turned for the door, and then the whisper came, right next to my ear. Cold. I ran, didn't stop until I was in the hallway, heart slamming against my ribs. Tom looked up from his desk, startled. Jesus, what's wrong with you? I could barely get the words out. The drawer, Mark's drawer, it opened. Tom's face went pale. Slowly, he stood up, walked past me. He didn't go inside, just stood at the threshold, peering in. Then he reached out and pulled the door shut. Locked it. He turned back to me, his expression unreadable. Don't go in there again tonight. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I just sat at my desk, shaking, until the morning crew came in. When they did, I went back. Mark's drawer was shut, locked. I asked around casually if anyone had opened it recently. Everyone said no, and that was it. I never heard it again. Never saw anything else. But I started taking my breaks outside after that. I stopped staying late. Story 5. I used to work night shifts at a nursing home. It wasn't a bad job, but it had its moments. The kind that stay with you long after you leave. This was a small place. Not one of those massive facilities with wings and floors full of staff. We had maybe 20 residents on our side of the building, and at night it was just me and one other person on shift. It could get lonely, but you got used to it. There were always complaints from the residents, not about us, but about a man in their rooms at night. It wasn't unusual. Hallucinations are common in the elderly, especially those with dementia. You learn to brush it off. I did, until that night. It was late, past 1 in the morning. I was in the dining room mopping the floor. The dining room had these massive windows overlooking the garden. During the day it was nice. At night those windows turned into black mirrors. The room was dimly lit, just the emergency lights and a few wall sconces. Enough to see, but not enough to shake the feeling that the dark outside was pressing in. I remember the silence. No sound except the wet drag of the mop on tile. Then a shift. That strange, awful sensation that someone is watching you. I stopped, gripping the mop, listening. Nothing. But I knew, deep in my gut, that I wasn't alone. I looked up. My reflection stared back at me in the dark glass. And behind me, a man. He was standing right behind me, close enough that I should have felt him breathing down my neck. A brown suit like something out of an old photograph, slightly wrinkled. A bowler hat, tilted just slightly to one side. But his face is what I will never forget. His skin looked stretched too tight, his features sharp, angular. His mouth, God, his mouth. It was too wide, his lips pulled back in a grin that was all wrong. Too many teeth, too much space, and his eyes. They were looking right at me, right through me. I couldn't move. My hands clenched the mop handle, frozen in place. It lasted seconds, but it felt like an eternity. He was grinning, just standing there, and then his mouth moved. Not a word, not a sound. Just that grotesque grin widening, his lips forming shapes that meant nothing, stretching too far, too wide. I turned, spun so fast I nearly fell. Nothing. The dining room was empty. Just me, the mop, the dim lights. My breath was coming in short, panicked bursts, my hands shaking. But I knew what I saw. I knew. I didn't finish mopping. I left the bucket where it was and walked straight out. Didn't even look at the windows again. I spent the rest of my shift at the nurse's station, staring at the clock, waiting for morning. When the day shift came in, I was already grabbing my stuff, ready to go. I didn't tell anyone. What would I have said? That I saw a man who wasn't there? That I saw the thing our residents had been talking about for months? I put in my notice 2 days later. Didn't even finish the week. I never went back. Story 6. I grew up in a rural town where family was everything. Every weekend, the whole clan would gather at my grandparents' house. It was a big old wooden place with a wide front porch, creaky floorboards, and the smell of coffee always lingering in the air. My grandfather, Lolo, was the heart of it all. He had this presence, always in his worn-out hat, always watching over us. One particular Saturday, a bunch of us cousins were playing in the yard like usual. It was hot, the air thick with the smell of dust and grass. We were running around arguing over a game of tag when we saw him, Lolo, walking up the driveway toward the house. It wasn't weird at first. He always arrived later in the day, after tending to things at his place a few towns over. We all ran to greet him. "Lolo!" we shouted, laughing, waving. He smiled at us, just a small, tired smile like he always did. He didn't say much, just nodded as he climbed up the steps onto the porch. We watched as he took off his hat and hung it on the hook right by the door, like he always did. Then he stepped inside. That was it. We went back to playing, nothing feeling out of place, until maybe 20 minutes later, when we heard the sound of a car speeding up the driveway. My uncle's truck. He drove like a madman, the tires skidding to a stop in the gravel. We all turned as he jumped out, slamming the door behind him. His face was pale, frantic. Something was wrong. Then came the sound of crying from inside the house. We all froze. That deep, gut-wrenching wailing. The kind you only hear when something truly terrible has happened. My stomach twisted. We ran inside, pushing past the screen door, our laughter completely gone. The adults were huddled in the kitchen. My mother was crying, my aunts clutching their chests like they couldn't breathe. My uncle, the one who had just arrived, was shaking his head over and over. "What's happening?" I asked. Nobody answered right away. My other uncle turned to us, his voice thick when he finally spoke. "Lolo's gone." The words barely made sense. "What do you mean?" my cousin asked. "We just saw him." Silence. The adults just stared at us. "No," my uncle said. His voice was firm, like he was trying to push reality onto us. "He died this morning, early. Your grandma just got the call." We all started talking at once. "No, that's wrong. He was just here. We saw him walk into the house." But they didn't believe us. Not at first. They thought we were mistaken or playing some kind of cruel joke. But we weren't. We knew what we saw. "He hung his hat," I said suddenly, my voice shaking. Everyone went quiet. "What?" my mother whispered. "His hat," I repeated, turning to the front door. My heart pounded as I pointed. "He hung it right there." All of us kids turned, leading the charge to the doorway. The adults followed slowly, hesitating like they were scared of what they might see. And then, there it was, hanging on the hook, exactly where he always left it. Lolo's hat. My mother gasped, covering her mouth. My aunt let out this little choking sound. My uncle stepped forward, his hands shaking as he reached for it. But then he stopped. Nobody touched it. Nobody spoke. My cousins and I looked at each other, hearts racing. We had seen him. We had spoken to him. He was here, but he couldn't have been. One of the aunts started whispering prayers under her breath. My uncle took a step back, shaking his head, looking like he was about to be sick. Then, as if on cue, a cold draft rushed through the house. It was fast, unnatural. The curtains shuddered and the floor creaked under a weight that wasn't there. And in that moment, we all felt it. Lola was still here. We never touched that hat. Story 7. I used to work the night shift as a nurse assistant on the cancer floor of a hospital. It wasn't just an oncology ward. It was also where the hospice patients stayed, the ones who weren't going to make it. Death was a constant. I got used to it faster than I thought I would. You have to, or you won't last long in that job. But there was one night I'll never forget. It was around 2:30 in the morning. Most of the floor was quiet except for the occasional beeping of IV pumps and the low hum of the ventilation system. We had a patient pass about an hour earlier, a man in his late 50s. His family had been there all evening, and they'd finally left after the funeral home came to take him. I had just finished stocking supplies when I noticed room 509's call light was on. That was his room, the dead man's room. I frowned. Maybe one of the nurses had gone in and forgotten to turn it off. It happens sometimes. So I went to check. The door was shut, just like we had left it after the body was removed. The hallway outside was empty, and the nurse's station was down at the other end of the hall, where the charge nurse was filling out paperwork. I pushed open the door. Dark. Empty. Just a stripped bed, the mattress still indented where he had lain. No movement, no sound, except for the call light chime still going off. I stepped inside, swallowing the unease creeping up my spine. "Hello?" I don't know why I said it. Force of habit, maybe. No answer. Of course not. I walked to the wall panel and pressed the button to turn off the call light. It clicked off, and the room was silent again. I let out a breath and turned to leave. The call light came back on. I froze. My skin prickled, and my stomach dropped. I hadn't even taken my finger off the button for a full second before it turned back on. I turned it off again. Another pause, silence. Then, click. The light came back on. I backed up toward the door, my heart hammering. There was no one here. No patient, no visitors, no nurses, nothing. Something wasn't right. I stepped out into the hallway, expecting to see someone, anyone, who might be messing with me. But the hallway was still empty. I stood there for a second, trying to shake off the sudden chill crawling up my back. Then the intercom crackled. A weak, rasping breath filled the speakers, followed by something that sounded like a word, but I couldn't make it out. Room 509's intercom. Every hair on my body stood on end. I turned, staring at the speaker in the ceiling. My breath caught in my throat. No one was in that room. No one was in the bed. But someone, or something, had just used the intercom. My hands were shaking as I forced myself to move. I went straight to the nurse's station, where our charge nurse, Lisa, was still filling out paperwork. "You called into room 509?" she asked, barely glancing up. "No," I said. My voice sounded small, wrong. Lisa frowned. "The light's on again." "I know." I swallowed hard. "Lisa, there's no one in there." She sighed and got up, rubbing her temples. "It's probably a malfunction. Let's go reset it." I followed her, feeling like my legs were made of lead. We reached the room. The door was still slightly open, the soft glow of the call light visible from the hallway. Lisa walked in first. I hesitated, then stepped in after her, keeping close to the doorway. She pressed the reset button. The light turned off. She exhaled sharply. "See? Probably just stuck," she said. Then, the call light clicked on again. Lisa stiffened. Her hand hovered over the panel for a second longer than it should have. Slowly, she turned her head to look at me. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, the intercom crackled again. A breath, slow, rattling. Then a voice, hoarse, strained. "Help me!" Lisa turned white. "What the hell?" she whispered. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The sound had come from inside the room, through the intercom, but there was no one in the bed. The room was empty. The air was thick, heavy, pressing down on my chest. Then the call light shut off on its own. The intercom went silent. The room felt colder, like something had left. Lisa turned and walked out without a word. I didn't hesitate to follow. We didn't talk about it. Not that night, not the next day. Ever. The room stayed empty for 2 more nights. No more call lights, no more voices. Then a new patient was admitted, and nothing strange ever happened in room 509 again. Story 8, I grew up in a small town where weird things didn't happen, or at least that's what people told themselves. My mom's house was old, one of those big Victorian places that had been added onto over the years. It had been in the family forever, and with it came some history. See, it used to be the town's funeral home, and the morgue was still attached to the back of the house. It was just there, part of the house, like the kitchen or the living room. My mom never thought anything of it. She lived there most of her life. It was normal to her. But other people? Not so much. Tom was my mom's boyfriend. He wasn't the jumpy type, not the kind of guy who got spooked easy. He worked construction, had a thick build, calloused hands. He'd been around long enough to have seen some things, but none of it prepared him for that day. It was a late afternoon when he stopped by. My mom wasn't home, but that wasn't unusual. They'd been together long enough that he felt comfortable letting himself in, so he parked out front and walked up to the house. As he passed by the side, he noticed something strange. The door to the old morgue was open. That wasn't normal. My mom always kept it locked. We didn't use it for anything anymore. It was just an empty space, like a storage room nobody wanted to put things in. The windows were open too, which was even weirder. They had these old, rusted latches that barely moved, and I couldn't remember the last time they'd been opened. But there they were, swung wide like someone had forced them open from the inside. Tom hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. He stepped inside. The air was stale, like a place sealed off for too long. The floor was still tiled, and the walls had that white, clinical look, even though time had made them yellow. There were no lights in there anymore, just a few old fixtures that didn't work, so it was dim, the daylight filtering through the open windows, casting long, grayish shadows. He walked through, checking everything. Nothing seemed out of place, but the open windows and door didn't sit right with him. Maybe my mom had been airing it out for some reason. He didn't know, but he shut the windows, locked them, and closed the door tight. Gave the knob a good jiggle to make sure it was secure. Then he went inside the house to wait. He sat down in the living room, turned on the TV, tried to relax. But something wasn't sitting right with him. He told me later it was like a pressure in the air, like the kind before a storm, when everything feels too still. The house was quiet, too quiet. He tried to ignore it. And then it happened. A bang so loud it shook the walls. Tom jumped up, heart pounding. It had come from the back, from the morgue. He ran to the hallway, stopping just short of the door leading outside. He didn't want to open it. Every instinct in him screamed not to, but he had to see. Slowly, he reached for the handle, turned it, and stepped outside. The door to the morgue was wide open again. The windows, the ones he had latched shut, were open too. Not just open. Forced all the way out, the latches snapped clean off. The door itself wasn't just ajar. It was thrown open so hard it had slammed against the exterior wall. Tom stood there, frozen. There was no wind, no one around. He knew that he had locked everything. And yet, there it was, wide open like before. Then from inside, something scraped. A long, slow, dragging sound, like something heavy moving across the tile. That was enough. Tom didn't check. He didn't go inside. He turned, walked straight through the house, and got in his truck. He didn't even slam the door, just threw it into reverse and backed out so fast he nearly took out the mailbox. He called my mom later, told her what happened. She didn't believe him at first, said maybe the wind had done it, maybe he hadn't latched it right. But when she checked the next morning, she found the window latches broken, just like he said. And the door? The hinges had nearly been torn out of the wood. She never talked about it after that. And Tom, he never went near that morgue again. Story 9. I used to work in a morgue. Not for long, just about 6 months. I wasn't a coroner or anything. I just handled the bodies, transported them, did some light cleaning, and occasionally assisted with paperwork. It was quiet work, and at the time I thought I didn't mind quiet. I thought I had a strong stomach. I thought I didn't scare easy. That job taught me otherwise. I lived in a small town in Kentucky, about an hour from Louisville. The county morgue wasn't big, just a few rooms, cold metal tables, and those steel drawers you see in movies. There was a small office space, a break room that smelled like burnt coffee, and a locker room where I kept my stuff. It wasn't bad work. Morbid, yeah, but not hard. The dead don't talk back, and for the most part, they stay where you put them, most of the time. It happened on a Thursday night. I was working late because a car accident had brought in 3 bodies, and there was paperwork to file before the medical examiner came in the next morning. I was alone. My shift partner had called in sick, and the front desk lady had left hours ago. It was just me and the bodies. I was used to it by then. The silence, the dim hum of the refrigeration units, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. I had a routine. Put on some music, work through the files, finish up and leave before my mind started playing tricks on me. That night, I was just about done when I heard it. A thump, not loud, just a dull, solid sound, like something shifting. My first thought was that one of the trays wasn't latched properly. That had happened before. Sometimes the old units didn't close all the way, and the suction of the cooling system would make the body inside settle. Annoying, but not unusual. I sighed, got up, and walked to the cold room. 5 bodies were in there, lined up neatly in their steel beds. I checked the first drawer, then the second. Everything was in place. Then I looked at the third. It was open, not all the way, just a few inches. Just enough to see the white sheet inside, just enough to feel the cold air seeping out. I frowned. I knew I had closed that drawer. I stepped closer and grabbed the handle, ready to push it back in. Then the sheet moved. My breath caught in my throat. I stared, frozen, as the fabric shifted like something underneath it had twitched. I thought maybe the air pressure was causing it to settle, that I was seeing things because I was tired. Then the body sat up. It wasn't slow, it wasn't gradual. 1 second it was lying there, covered in the sheet. The next it was upright, like someone yanking a puppet by the strings. The sheet slid off, crumpling into its lap, and I saw its face. It was a man, late 50s, maybe early 60s. His skin was gray, lips slightly parted, eyes open and looking at me. Not clouded over, not lifeless, just looking. His mouth twitched, like he was trying to speak, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, slamming into the metal table behind me. My brain was screaming at me to run, to do something, but my body wouldn't move. I just stood there, heart hammering so hard it hurt. Then he breathed, a slow, wet rattle. like his lungs were full of fluid. His chest rose, his fingers twitched. He was sitting there, alive, when I had put him in that drawer not even 4 hours ago. Jesus Christ, I whispered, barely able to get the words out. His lips moved again. This time something came out. Just one word. Cold. His voice was raw, hoarse, like it had been dragged across gravel. His hands trembled as he reached out, like he was trying to grasp something. Me. I yanked myself back, pressing against the table so hard I thought my spine would snap. Every instinct I had told me to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't stop staring at him. Then, just as suddenly as he had sat up, he stopped. His body sagged, his arms dropping limp at his sides. His eyes, still locked on mine, went glassy. And then, just like that, he collapsed, slumped forward, his head cracking against the edge of the drawer. The wet rattle in his throat cut off. His chest stilled. He was dead again. I stood there panting, my hands shaking so hard I thought they'd fall off. The room felt smaller, colder. My skin was clammy, my stomach twisting. I waited. I don't know what I was waiting for. Maybe for him to move again, maybe for someone to shake me awake and tell me it was a dream. But nothing happened. He was just dead. Minutes passed before I could move. When I finally did, I forced myself to step forward and check his pulse. Nothing. His skin was cold. His body was limp. He was dead, like he was supposed to be. I shoved him back into the drawer, slammed it shut, locked it. Then I turned and left. I didn't finish the paperwork. I didn't turn off the lights. I walked straight out of that building, got into my car, and drove home without looking back. The next morning, I called my boss and quit. No notice, no explanation. I just said I couldn't do it anymore. He didn't argue. Maybe he could hear it in my voice. Maybe he knew. I never went back. I never told anyone. I don't know what happened that night, and I don't want to know. Maybe there's an explanation. Maybe there isn't. All I know is that I saw a dead man sit up, look at me, and die twice. And that was enough for me. Story 10. I used to bartend at this old country club, one of those places that had been around forever. It was built in the late 1800s, and you could tell. The wood was warped and dark, the chandeliers were older than my grandparents, and the whole place just had that musty, heavy kind of silence, like it was holding its breath. There was a story about how, years ago, a natural disaster had wiped out a good part of the town, and they'd used the ballroom as a temporary morgue. I never gave much thought to that kind of thing. I didn't believe in ghosts, didn't get creeped out easily. But that place, it got under my skin, not in any overt way, just little things. Most nights I was the last one out. I'd clean up, cash out the till, and lock everything up before heading home. The place always felt too quiet when it was just me. I'd turn off all the lights in the bar, check the doors twice, and get out as fast as I could. But the worst part? More times than I could count, I'd be halfway to my car and see the bar lights still on through the windows. Every time I'd swear up and down I turned them off, but I couldn't just leave them. I had to go back inside. It was one thing to be inside a haunted-feeling building when you were working, but walking back into the pitch-black country club, alone? Different story. One night, it was worse. It had been a long shift, and I was dead on my feet. It was past 2 in the morning, and I just wanted to go home. I went through my usual routine, turned off the lights, checked the doors, made sure the stereo was off, because sometimes that damn thing would turn itself back on too, and left. I was halfway across the parking lot when I saw it. The lights were on in the bar. Not just the main lights, but the ones behind the bar, the ones that illuminated the liquor bottles like a display. It wasn't dim. It was bright, like someone had walked right in behind me and flipped every switch. I stopped dead. I stared at those windows, my stomach doing this slow, crawling twist inside me. It wasn't possible. I had turned them off, and then the stereo turned on. I couldn't hear it, not from the lot, but I saw the way the glass in the windows trembled, just slightly with the bass. It was on, loud. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as hell. My keys were clutched in my hand, and I had this instinct, This overwhelming gut reaction screaming at me to just leave it. Go home. Ignore it. But I knew my manager checked the cameras every morning. If those lights were still on, if the music was blasting when the opening shift came in, it'd be on me. So like an idiot, I went back inside. The second I pushed open the heavy front doors, the silence hit me. The music wasn't playing anymore. The lights were still on, bright as ever, but the music had stopped. I hesitated in the entryway, breathing shallow. It felt different. The country club was old, and at night it creaked and settled like any other old building. But this was something else. It felt waiting, like something was holding perfectly still, just out of sight. I forced myself to move forward, stepping into the main bar area. The lights were almost too bright, glaring down like stage lights. I went straight for the switches behind the bar, flipping them off. The room plunged into darkness, except for the emergency exit signs. That's when I heard it, a shuffle, a faint sound of movement somewhere deeper in the club. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I should have run. I should have bolted for the door, but my body wouldn't listen. Instead, I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkened room. Nothing. And then, the stereo blared back on, loud, deafening, some old jazz tune, warbling and distorted. I jumped so hard I nearly tripped. My hands shot out, fumbling for the stereo controls under the bar, slamming the power button. The music cut off instantly, leaving behind a ringing silence. My pulse was hammering. I sucked in a breath, turning, ready to leave. And that's when I saw him, a figure, standing just inside the doorway to the ballroom, not moving, just standing. He was tall, lanky, dressed in something dark, too dark, like the shadows clung to him, making it hard to tell where he ended and the darkness began. His face, I can't describe it. Not really, not in a way that makes sense. It was wrong, not deformed, not disfigured, just wrong. Stretched, too smooth, like it hadn't decided what it was supposed to be yet. My heart slammed against my ribs. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But my feet were rooted to the damn floor, and I couldn't look away. And then, he twitched. Just a small, unnatural movement, like a glitch in a video. Then another, a jerky half-step forward. I broke. I turned and sprinted. I didn't care if the lights were on. I didn't care if the stereo was blaring. I didn't even care if my manager saw it all on camera the next day and fired me for leaving everything unlocked. I ran full speed through the dark, out the front doors, across the parking lot, and into my car. I didn't even stop to buckle my seatbelt. I slammed the key into the ignition, started the engine, and peeled out of there so fast my tires screeched against the pavement. I didn't slow down, not until I was miles away, not until I could finally breathe again. I never went back. Called in the next day and quit over the phone. My manager was pissed. Didn't matter. I wasn't stepping foot in that place ever again. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.